In the quiet corridors of Adelaide Cottage, where royal protocols fade into whispered conversations and genuine tears, Princess Catherine faced a battle that no amount of preparation could have readied her for. This isn't the story of a perfect princess maintaining her composure, it's the raw, unfiltered account of a mother, wife, and future queen who discovered that sometimes the greatest victories come disguised as devastating setbacks. When the world expected grace under pressure, Catherine found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about strength, vulnerability, and what it truly means to fight for those you love. Behind the carefully crafted public statements and coordinated royal appearances lay a woman grappling with fear, hope, and the crushing weight of uncertainty that comes with a cancer diagnosis. This is her story, not the sanitized version fit for press releases, but the authentic journey of someone who learned that showing weakness can be the most powerful thing a future queen can do. The morning arrived like any other at Adelaide Cottage, but Catherine knew immediately that something had shifted. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold, staring at her phone where Dr. Matthew's missed call notification blinked persistently. 3 rings. She had counted them before letting it go to voicemail, unable to summon the courage to answer. William moved quietly around the kitchen, making breakfast for the children with practiced efficiency. The familiar sounds, the gentle clink of plates, the soft whoosh of the kettle, George's sleepy complaints about having to wear his school blazer created a backdrop of normalcy that felt almost surreal against the storm brewing in Catherine's chest. "Mummy, you're not eating," Charlotte observed with the sharp awareness that seemed to run in the family. Her daughter's concerned voice cut through Catherine's fog, pulling her back to the present moment. "Just thinking about today, darling," Catherine managed, forcing what she hoped was a reassuring smile. The lie came easily, a skill she'd perfected over years of public life, but it sat heavy in her throat. The truth was far more complicated. Yesterday's appointment had not gone as expected. For months, Catherine had been riding a wave of cautious optimism. The initial treatment had shown promise, the tumor markers had been encouraging, and she had allowed herself to believe that perhaps this nightmare was nearing its end. She had even started planning small steps back into public life, imagining a gradual return to the duties that had defined her adult life. But Dr. Matthew's expression had told a different story before he'd even spoken the words. The latest scans revealed what they all feared, but no one wanted to voice: the cancer had found a way to adapt, to resist, to continue its unwelcome presence in her body. "We need to discuss adjusting your treatment plan," he had said gently, his kind eyes reflecting the weight of delivering difficult news to someone he'd grown to care about beyond the professional relationship. "The current approach isn't giving us the results we hoped for." The words had hit her like physical blows. Adjustment. New plan. Different medication. Each phrase was carefully chosen to soften the reality that her body was not responding as they had hoped, that the battle she thought she was winning was far from over. William's hand on her shoulder brought her back to the kitchen, to the immediate demands of motherhood and the careful choreography of getting 3 children ready for school. His touch was gentle but grounding, a silent reminder that she wasn't facing this alone. "The car will be here in 15 minutes, he said softly, his voice carrying none of the royal formality that colored his public speaking. Here, in their kitchen, he was simply a husband watching his wife struggle with news that would reshape their family's future once again. Catherine nodded, finally, taking a sip of her cold tea and grimacing at the bitter taste. Everything felt wrong this morning: the temperature of her drink, the way her clothes hung on her body, the strange quality of the autumn light streaming through their windows. Even the cottage, which had become their sanctuary during her treatment, felt somehow different. Louis bounded into the kitchen with his characteristic enthusiasm, his school bag dragging behind him and his hair standing up in several directions despite Catherine's efforts the night before. At 5, he remained blissfully unaware of the weight pressing down on his parents' shoulders, and Catherine felt grateful for his innocence. "Can we play football when I get home?" he asked, launching himself into Catherine's lap with the fearless abandon of childhood. His small arms wrapped around her neck, and she breathed in the familiar scent of his hair, a mixture of children's shampoo and the outdoors. "We'll see, sweetheart," she replied, holding him perhaps a moment longer than usual. The simple request felt loaded with implications she wasn't ready to face. Would there be afternoons for football? Would she have the energy? Would the new treatment leave her bedridden like the early days after her diagnosis? The drive to school passed in a blur of familiar streets and routine conversations. Catherine found herself memorizing small details, the way George adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror with growing teenage self-consciousness, Charlotte's animated description of her upcoming presentation on wildlife conservation, Louis's excited chatter about a new friend in his class. These moments felt precious in a way they hadn't before. Each ordinary interaction suddenly weighted with the possibility that everything could change again. After dropping the children off, Catherine and William drove in comfortable silence to the appointment that would determine their next steps. The medical center had become unfortunately familiar over the past months, its sterile corridors and efficient staff part of a routine Catherine had never wanted to learn. Dr. Matthews was waiting in his office, the same gentle demeanor that had carried them through the initial diagnosis and treatment planning. But Catherine could read the subtle signs now, the way he arranged the papers on his desk just so, the careful positioning of the chairs, the extra box of tissues placed strategically within reach. The scans show that while the current treatment has helped, we're not seeing the progress we hoped for, he began, his voice carrying the practiced compassion of someone who delivered difficult news regularly. The cancer appears to be developing resistance to the current chemotherapy regimen. Catherine felt William's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. She had known this was coming, had felt it in her body, in the way her energy hadn't returned as expected, in the persistent symptoms that hadn't improved despite months of treatment. "What does that mean for Catherine?" William asked, his voice steady despite the tension Catherine could feel radiating from him. "It means we need to try a different approach," Dr. Matthews explained patiently. "There are several options available to us, but they will require starting over in many ways. The new treatment protocol will be more intensive, and the side effects may be more challenging." Starting over. The phrase echoed in Catherine's mind as Dr. Matthews outlined the new treatment plan. More intensive chemotherapy, possible radiation therapy, clinical trials that might offer hope but came with no guarantees. Each option carried its own risks and benefits, its own timeline and uncertainty. Catherine found herself focusing on strange details, the way the late morning sunlight created patterns on the doctor's desk, the soft sound of papers rustling, the distant hum of medical equipment. These small observations anchored her as the larger implications of the conversation swirled around her. The appointment stretched longer than expected, filled with medical terminology and careful explanations of side effects and success rates. Catherine asked the questions she had learned to ask, took notes in her careful handwriting, and nodded at appropriate moments. But part of her remained detached, observing the scene as if from outside her own body. On the drive home, the weight of the morning settled over them both. The carefully constructed optimism that had carried Catherine through the previous months felt fragile now, replaced by a familiar uncertainty that she had hoped never to feel again. "We'll figure this out," William said quietly as they pulled into their drive. "We've done it before, and we'll do it again." Catherine nodded, but the reassurance felt hollow. She had been strong before, had faced the diagnosis with courage, had endured the initial treatment with grace, had even found moments of hope and humor in the darkest times. But this setback felt different, more personal somehow, as if her own body had betrayed the trust she'd placed in it. Inside the cottage, the silence felt oppressive. Without the children's voices filling the space, Catherine became acutely aware of how much had changed since her diagnosis. The house that had once buzzed with activity now felt like a sanctuary that might become a prison if the new treatment left her too weak to leave it. She stood in the living room, looking at the family photos that lined the mantelpiece, images of happier times, of vacations and celebrations and ordinary moments that had seemed unremarkable when they were captured. Now they felt like evidence of a life that might be slipping away, moment by moment. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. William's private secretary, checking on scheduling for the coming weeks. Catherine listened to William's careful responses, the way he protected information while providing enough detail to manage their public responsibilities. Even in crisis, the machinery of royal life continued, demanding attention and energy she wasn't sure she could spare. As the day wore on, Catherine found herself moving through familiar routines with a strange sense of disconnection. She prepared lunch that neither of them ate, sorted through mail that seemed inconsequential, and answered messages from family members with carefully crafted responses that revealed nothing of the morning's devastation. The afternoon brought the sounds of returning children, car doors slamming, backpacks hitting the floor, voices calling for snacks and attention. Catherine summoned energy she didn't feel, asking about their day and listening to their stories with genuine interest despite the storm clouds gathering in her mind. But, that evening, after baths were finished and bedtime stories read, after William had handled the last of the day's responsibilities and the cottage had settled into its nighttime quiet, Catherine finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the day's revelations. She stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the darkened grounds that had become their refuge from public scrutiny. The privacy that had once felt like a luxury now felt like isolation, a barrier between her and a world that continued to function normally while her own existence felt increasingly fragile. The new treatment would begin next week. There would be new side effects to manage, new uncertainties to navigate, new ways that cancer would reshape their family's life. The optimism that had carried her through the initial diagnosis felt harder to summon now, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. William found her there, offering wordless comfort that somehow meant more than any reassurance could have. Together, they faced the darkness beyond their window and the uncertain path that lay ahead, finding strength not in false optimism but in the simple fact of being together in whatever came next. The new treatment began on a Tuesday morning that dawned gray and uninviting, as if the weather itself understood the weight of what lay ahead. Catherine had prepared herself as thoroughly as possible, reading every piece of literature the medical team had provided, asking detailed questions about side effects and timelines, even researching online support groups for people facing similar treatment changes. But no amount of preparation could have readied her for the reality of starting over. The infusion center had become familiar territory over the past months, its comfortable chairs and calming color scheme designed to make an unpleasant experience slightly more bearable. Catherine had developed routines during her previous treatments, which chair she preferred, what snacks helped with the nausea, how to position herself to minimize the discomfort of the floor. Now, facing a different medication with a different protocol, those small comforts felt inadequate. The new drug required a longer infusion time and came with warnings about side effects that her previous treatment had spared her. Dr. Matthews had been thorough in his explanations, but experiencing them firsthand was an entirely different challenge. Within days, Catherine realized that this treatment would demand a level of surrender she hadn't anticipated. Where her previous chemotherapy had left her tired but functional, this new regimen seemed to reach deeper into her reserves, leaving her struggling to find energy for even basic tasks. The first week passed in a haze of sleep and nausea. Catherine found herself spending most of her time in the master bedroom, emerging only when absolutely necessary. The cottage that had been filled with her presence, her laughter, her questions about the children's day, her gentle corrections and warm encouragement now felt strangely hollow. William took on more of the daily responsibilities with characteristic efficiency, but Catherine could see the strain in his face during the brief moments when he thought she wasn't watching. He juggled conference calls with government officials while checking on her every few hours, managed the children's schedules while coordinating with her medical team, and maintained the facade of normalcy while privately grappling with watching his wife disappear into illness. "The children are asking about you," he mentioned gently one evening as he brought her dinner on a tray. The simple statement carried layers of complexity, their growing concern, his struggle to explain her absence, the careful balance of honesty and reassurance that parenting required. Catherine looked at the food he'd prepared with such care and felt her stomach revolt at the sight. Everything smelled wrong, tasted metallic, or triggered waves of nausea that left her exhausted. "What are you telling them?" she asked, pushing the tray aside apologetically. "That mummy is getting medicine that makes her very tired, but the doctors are taking good care of her," William replied, settling into the chair beside the bed with his own untouched dinner. They had become united in their inability to eat, though for different reasons. The explanation felt both true and inadequate. How could they convey to their children that this was potentially worse than before without destroying their sense of security? George, at 10, was old enough to pick up on the subtle changes in household dynamics. Charlotte's questions had become more direct and harder to deflect. Even Louis seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted. By the second week, Catherine's world had contracted to the size of her bedroom. The bathroom felt like a marathon journey. The stairs to the main floor became impossible without William's help. She found herself sleeping 16 hours a day, waking only to attempt small sips of water or weak tea before surrendering back to unconsciousness. The woman who had run marathons, who had chased her children through palace gardens, who had stood for hours at public events with a smile never wavering, that woman felt like a stranger from another life. In her place was someone Catherine barely recognized, someone whose body felt foreign and unreliable. Dr. Matthews made house calls now, a concession to Catherine's inability to travel that made the seriousness of her situation starkly clear. His visits became checkpoints in weeks that otherwise blended together in a fog of medication and exhaustion. "This is expected," he assured William during one such visit, his voice low enough that he thought Catherine couldn't hear from the bed. "The new protocol is aggressive, but we're seeing some positive indicators in her blood work." Positive indicators. Catherine clung to those words like a lifeline, even as her body seemed to be shutting down around her. The contradiction between what the tests showed and what she experienced daily created a strange disconnection from her own recovery process. The isolation was perhaps the most unexpected challenge. Where her previous treatment had allowed for visitors and gentle activities, this regimen left her too exhausted for conversation and too sensitive to light and sound for much stimulation. The cottage, which had always been filled with people, family members, close friends, staff members who had become like family, now operated around her illness with hushed voices and careful footsteps. Catherine began to understand why some people described cancer treatment as losing yourself bit by bit. The woman she had been felt increasingly distant, the mother who helped with homework, the wife who discussed daily decisions with William, the future queen who maintained correspondence with patronages and charities she cared deeply about. All of those roles felt beyond her current capabilities. The children adapted with the resilience that seemed to be their birthright, but Catherine could see the impact in small ways. George became more serious, taking on a protective role that aged him beyond his years. Charlotte threw herself into her studies with an intensity that suggested she was trying to control something in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. Louis, too young to fully understand but old enough to feel the change, became clingy in a way that was heartbreaking and impossible to satisfy given Catherine's physical limitations. William tried to bridge the gap, bringing the children to her bedside for brief visits when she felt strong enough. These moments became precious beyond measure, Charlotte reading aloud from her favorite book, George showing her drawings from art class, Louis simply curling up beside her in silent companionship. But they also highlighted everything Catherine was missing. The everyday conversations about friends and homework and playground conflicts, the bedtime routines that had been sacred in their household, the spontaneous moments of connection that make up the fabric of family life, all of it was happening around her rather than with her. 3 weeks into the new treatment, Catherine experienced what Dr. Matthews clinically termed a nadir, the point at which the chemotherapy's impact on her immune system reached its lowest point. For Catherine, it felt less clinical and more like falling through the bottom of her own life. She developed a fever that spiked dangerously high in the middle of the night, prompting a frightening rush to the hospital that she would later remember only in fragments. William's tense voice on the phone with the medical team, the strange sensation of being carried, the bright lights of the emergency room that seemed to pierce directly into her skull. The hospital admission lasted 4 days during which Catherine drifted between sleep and a strange wakefulness that felt disconnected from reality. William maintained a constant vigil, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair beside her bed and managing their responsibilities remotely with the help of private secretaries who had been sworn to absolute discretion. The children were told she needed to stay at the hospital for a few days to get better medicine, another carefully crafted truth that protected them while acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. They sent drawings and recorded voice messages that William played softly when Catherine was awake enough to listen. During those hospital days, Catherine found herself confronting fears she hadn't allowed herself to fully acknowledge. What if the new treatment didn't work? What if her body couldn't withstand what was needed to fight the cancer? What if she had to face the possibility that her time with her children might be more limited than she had ever imagined? The thoughts came and went like fever dreams, sometimes sharp with terror and sometimes oddly peaceful. She found herself remembering moments with intense clarity, the feeling of George as a baby falling asleep on her chest, the sound of Charlotte's first laugh, the way Louis's hand felt so small in hers when they walked together. These memories felt like gifts and torments simultaneously, precious beyond measure and painful in their poignancy. They represented everything she was fighting for and everything she feared losing. When she was finally well enough to return home, the cottage felt both familiar and strange. Her absence had been brief, but it had shifted something fundamental in the household dynamics. The children seemed more subdued, more aware of how quickly their normal world could change. William moved with the careful efficiency of someone managing a crisis, maintaining routines while preparing for any emergency. Catherine's bedroom had been transformed in her absence, a hospital bed had been brought in for easier position changes, medical equipment discreetly placed within reach, and communication devices set up so she could stay connected to her medical team without leaving the house. The changes were practical and necessary, but they served as constant reminders of how much her world had contracted. Recovery from the hospitalization was slow and frustrating. Catherine found herself having to rebuild strength she had already lost and regained once before. Simple tasks like showering required help and left her exhausted. Eating remained a challenge that required constant vigilance and creativity from William and their housekeeper. But perhaps the most difficult aspect was the growing awareness that this treatment path might not lead where they all hoped it would. Dr. Matthews remained professionally optimistic, but Catherine had learned to read the subtle indicators in his manner and choice of words. The treatment was working, but not as dramatically as they had hoped. There were signs of progress, but also evidence that the cancer remained stubborn and adaptable. As October gave way to November, Catherine began to grapple with a new kind of uncertainty. Not just whether she would recover, but whether she would have enough time to be the mother, wife, and future queen she had always envisioned herself being. The role she had trained for her entire adult life felt increasingly fragile, dependent on a body and future that no longer felt entirely under her control. The isolation of her treatment created space for thoughts and fears she might have been able to avoid in a busier, healthier time. Without the constant demands of public engagements and family activities, Catherine found herself alone with questions that had no easy answers and fears that couldn't be dismissed with positive thinking or royal training. Yet even in this darkness, small moments of connection continued to anchor her. William's quiet presence during the worst days, the children's handmade cards and recorded messages, the way their housekeeper found creative ways to prepare foods that might tempt Catherine's compromised appetite, these gestures reminded her that she wasn't fighting alone, even when the battle felt intensely personal. As the first month of new treatment drew to a close, Catherine realized that this phase of her journey would require a different kind of courage than she had needed before. Not the courage to maintain a public facade or to endure painful treatment, but the courage to face genuine uncertainty about her future while continuing to live as fully as possible in whatever present moment she had. The turning point came not with dramatic fanfare but in a quiet moment on a December morning when Catherine woke up and realized she had slept through the night without interruption for the first time in weeks. The absence of nausea, the lack of fever, the simple ability to open her eyes without the room spinning, these small mercies felt monumental after months of relentless symptoms. She lay still for several minutes, afraid to move and break whatever spell had granted her this reprieve. Through the bedroom curtains, she could see snow beginning to fall, the first of the season coating their garden in pristine white. The sight stirred something in her that had been dormant for weeks, not quite hope, but perhaps the possibility of hope. William found her sitting up in bed when he brought her morning tea, and something in her posture made him pause in the doorway. She was looking out the window rather than lying with her eyes closed, and there was a quality to her stillness that felt different from the exhausted unconsciousness that had characterized her recent weeks. "Good morning," he said carefully, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile improvement he was witnessing. "Good morning," Catherine replied, and her voice carried a strength that surprised them both. She reached for the tea with steady hands, another small miracle that neither of them mentioned for fear of jinxing it. The improvement was gradual but undeniable. Dr. Matthews' next visit brought blood work results that reflected what Catherine's body was beginning to tell her. The aggressive treatment was finally showing the results they had hoped for. The cancer markers were dropping significantly, and her immune system was showing signs of recovery rather than continued suppression. "This is very encouraging," Dr. Matthews said, allowing himself a smile that reached his eyes for the first time in months. "We're not out of the woods yet, but we're definitely moving in the right direction." Catherine absorbed this news with a strange mixture of relief and caution. She had learned not to invest too heavily in positive reports, having experienced how quickly medical situations could change. But she also couldn't deny that her body felt different, not well, exactly, but no longer actively fighting itself with every breath. The first sign of returning strength came in her ability to join the family for dinner downstairs. The journey to the dining room required rest breaks and William's steady arm, but sitting at their familiar table felt like reclaiming a piece of her life that had been lost. The children's reaction to her presence was carefully contained excitement. They had learned not to overwhelm her with their enthusiasm, but Catherine could see the relief in their faces. George sat a little straighter, Charlotte's chatter became more animated, and Louis immediately abandoned his own chair to lean against her side. "Tell me about school," Catherine said, finding genuine energy for conversation for the first time in weeks. The simple request opened floodgates of stories and complaints and updates that she had been missing during her isolation upstairs. As she listened to Charlotte's detailed account of a science project and George's concerns about an upcoming football match, Catherine felt herself reconnecting with the role that mattered most to her, being their mother. Not the future queen or the public figure or even William's wife, but simply the person who cared about their daily triumphs and struggles more than anything else in the world. The recovery was not linear. Good days were followed by setbacks that reminded everyone how fragile the progress remained. But, gradually, Catherine found herself able to spend more time out of bed, to take short walks in the garden, to participate in family activities that had been impossible during the worst weeks of treatment. Christmas preparation became both a goal and a measure of improvement. Catherine had always been the driving force behind their family's holiday celebrations, creating traditions that balanced their unique circumstances with the normal experiences she wanted for their children. This year, she approached the season with modified expectations but renewed determination. She couldn't manage the elaborate cookie baking sessions of previous years, but she could supervise while the children decorated store-bought cookies. She couldn't shop for gifts in person, but she could direct William and their staff in selecting presents that would delight their recipients. Each small contribution felt like a victory over the disease that had tried to steal this season from their family. The children adapted to her limitations with grace that both impressed and broke Catherine's heart. They learned to bring their excitement to her rather than expecting her to chase after them. They developed quieter games that could be played from her bed when she needed rest. They became protective of her energy in ways that no child should have to learn. On Christmas Eve, Catherine managed to attend midnight service at their local church, her first public appearance since the treatment intensification began. The decision required careful coordination with her medical team and security, but it felt important to mark this moment of stability with something meaningful. Sitting in the familiar pew, surrounded by parishioners who had prayed for her recovery throughout her illness, Catherine felt the weight of community support that had sustained her family through the darkest weeks. The service took on deeper meaning as she reflected on themes of hope emerging from darkness, of light persisting through long nights. When they returned home, Catherine tucked each child into bed personally for the first time in months. The simple ritual of bedtime stories and goodnight kisses felt precious beyond measure. Louis fell asleep holding her hand, as if afraid she might disappear again if he let go. The new year brought continued improvements and new challenges. Dr. Matthews began discussing long-term recovery plans rather than crisis management. The aggressive treatment had achieved its goals, but Catherine would need ongoing monitoring and a modified chemotherapy protocol for several more months. The prospect of extended treatment was daunting, but it felt manageable in ways that would have been impossible to imagine during the worst weeks. Catherine had learned to measure progress in smaller increments, to find meaning in partial victories rather than waiting for complete recovery. January also brought the beginning of conversations about her eventual return to public duties. The palace communications team approached the subject delicately, understanding that Catherine's health remained the priority while recognizing the public interest in her recovery. Catherine found herself grappling with questions about what kind of public figure she wanted to be after this experience. The person who would eventually return to royal duties would be different from the one who had been diagnosed the previous year. She had gained perspectives on vulnerability, on the healthcare system, on the experience of ordinary people facing extraordinary medical challenges. The process of rebuilding her stamina for public engagements began slowly. Short meetings in their home, brief video calls with patronage organizations, and carefully managed appearances that could be cancelled without consequence if her health required it. Each successful engagement felt like reclaiming another piece of her identity. Catherine realized that she had feared not just losing her life to cancer, but losing her sense of purpose and contribution. The gradual return to meaningful work provided evidence that she could be both a cancer patient and an effective public servant. By February, Catherine was well enough to accompany William to a private dinner with close friends, her first social engagement in months. The evening required careful planning and early departure, but it marked a significant milestone in her journey back to normal life. Sitting around the familiar table, listening to conversation about politics and current events that had nothing to do with her illness, Catherine felt like herself in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. The cancer remained part of her reality, but it no longer defined the entirety of her existence. The children's adjustment to her recovery was as complex as their adjustment to her illness had been. They remained protective and careful in ways that tugged at Catherine's heart, but they also began to relax into the assumption that she would be present for their activities and available for their needs. George started bringing his friends around again, though Catherine noticed he stayed closer to home than he had before her illness. Charlotte resumed her detailed reports about school social dynamics, trusting that her mother had the energy to care about her complex friendships. Louis gradually stopped sleeping in their bedroom, returning to his own room with the confidence that she would be there in the morning. Spring brought not just seasonal renewal but concrete evidence of Catherine's medical progress. The latest scans showed continued improvement, and Dr. Matthews began using words like remission and long-term survival that had seemed impossible during the darkest weeks of winter. Catherine approached these positive developments with cautious optimism tempered by the wisdom that serious illness had taught her. She understood now that health was not a permanent state but a dynamic condition that required ongoing attention and gratitude. The experience had changed her relationship with uncertainty in fundamental ways. Where she had once planned months and years in advance with confidence in her ability to meet those commitments, she now approached the future with more flexibility and presence in the current moment. As her strength returned and her treatment schedule became less intensive, Catherine began to contemplate how her experience might inform her future work. The months of illness had given her intimate knowledge of the healthcare system, of the challenges facing families dealing with serious illness, of the gap between public support and private struggle. By late spring, Catherine was strong enough to resume a modified schedule of public engagements. Her first official appearance was at a cancer research facility, where she met with patients and families experiencing their own journeys with the disease. The visit was emotional in ways that her previous engagements had never been. She found herself connecting with people not just as a royal patron but as someone who understood the fear and uncertainty they were experiencing. Her questions were informed by personal experience, her compassion deepened by her own suffering. The public response to her return was overwhelmingly positive, but Catherine noticed that people related to her differently now. There was a warmth and protectiveness in how people approached her, as if her illness had made her more human and accessible rather than diminishing her status. As summer arrived, Catherine reflected on the year that had transformed her life so completely. The woman who had faced that first diagnosis seemed like a different person, more naive about her own vulnerability, more confident in her ability to control outcomes, less aware of how quickly everything could change. The person she had become through the experience of serious illness carried wisdom she wouldn't have chosen to acquire but was grateful to possess. She understood now that strength wasn't about avoiding difficulty but about finding ways to persist through it. She had learned that vulnerability could be a form of connection rather than weakness, that accepting help was sometimes the most courageous choice available. Her relationship with William had been tested and deepened through the crisis. They had learned to communicate about fears they had never had to voice before, to support each other through uncertainty that challenged everything they thought they knew about their future. The partnership that had begun with royal duties and public expectations had evolved into something more fundamental and resilient. The children, too, had grown in ways that were both heartbreaking and inspiring. They had learned lessons about impermanence and love that would shape them throughout their lives. Catherine hoped they would remember not just her illness but her recovery, not just the fear but the way their family had found strength together. As autumn returned, marking a full year since her diagnosis, Catherine stood in the same garden where she had first grappled with the reality of cancer. The physical space looked much the same, but her perspective had been transformed completely. She was not the same person who had received that first frightening diagnosis, nor was she the same person who had struggled through the darkest weeks of intensive treatment. She had become someone who understood that life was both more fragile and more resilient than she had ever imagined. The future remained uncertain in ways that her previous life had allowed her to ignore. But uncertainty no longer felt like a threat to be avoided. Instead, it felt like the natural condition of human existence, something to be acknowledged and navigated rather than conquered or controlled. Catherine's journey through cancer had taught her that the most important battles are often invisible to outside observers. The real victory was not in defeating disease but in discovering that she could face uncertainty without losing herself, that she could be vulnerable without being weak, and that accepting help was its own form of courage. As she prepared to return fully to public life, Catherine carried these lessons with her, not as burdens but as gifts that informed her service and deepened her connection to the people she served. Her experience had changed her in fundamental ways, but it had also revealed strengths she hadn't known she possessed and priorities she would carry forward into whatever future awaited her.